There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people carry around without ever examining. It involves jungles and helicopters and protest signs and a generation of young men who were sent somewhere they did not understand to fight something that was never fully explained. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. The incompleteness is not accidental. It was built into the war from the beginning, layered into every report, every press briefing, every official communique that traveled from Saigon to Washington and arrived slightly altered from what the men on the ground had actually seen. The Vietnam War was not misunderstood by the American public. It was misrepresented to them, systematically over years, by the institutions charged with fighting it. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a tragedy and a mechanism. A tragedy implies that better understanding might have changed something. A mechanism implies that the outcome was embedded in the structure itself, that the lying and the dying were not separate phenomena, but part of the same operation. What follows is an account of things that were known and not said, things that were reported and then buried, things that soldiers experienced and then spent decades trying to find language for, usually without success, usually in private. Usually because the public version of the war had so thoroughly occupied the space where the real version should have been that there was nowhere left to put the truth. The men who came home knew what had happened. They had been there. But the country they returned to had a war of its own, a war of symbols and narratives and political necessity, and that war had no room for complexity. So the complexity went underground. It stayed there. Much of it is still there. The first thing that has to be understood is the body count, not as a statistic, but as a theology. At some point in the early years of American involvement, military commanders realized that the traditional metrics of success in warfare did not apply to Vietnam. There was no territory to hold in any meaningful sense. There were no cities to capture that would end the conflict. There was no front line that, once crossed, would signal victory. So someone, somewhere in the chain of command, decided that the number of enemy dead would serve as the primary measure of progress. The logic seemed reasonable at the time. If you kill enough of the enemy, they will eventually stop fighting. The body count would prove that the enemy was being diminished. It would give reporters something to print, and congressmen something to cite, and generals something to put in their briefings. The body count would be the war made legible. What the body count became was something else entirely. Units were evaluated by their numbers. Officers were promoted or stagnated based on their numbers. The pressure to produce high counts was not occasional. It was constant and institutional and descended from the top of the command structure to the bottom. A platoon sergeant in the field understood, without being told explicitly, that his value to the army was measured in enemy dead, and that an operation which produced few or no bodies would be scrutinized, questioned, possibly attributed to timidity or poor aggressiveness. The sergeant did not need a memo. He just needed to watch how the men above him were treated. The consequences of this system were visible almost immediately to anyone paying attention, which meant they were visible to the soldiers and almost no one else. When a unit could not produce bodies, bodies were sometimes found. Vietnamese civilians who had been killed, for any reason or no reason, were catalogued as enemy combatants. Old men found in villages near firefight zones. Women who ran from advancing troops and were shot. Children whose presence near a weapons cache or a trail was treated as evidence of enemy affiliation. The bodies were counted. The counts went up. The briefings reflected the counts. The war was being won. There were officers who knew this and said so privately to colleagues they trusted. There were intelligence analysts who wrote reports noting the statistical impossibility of the enemy casualty figures, pointing out that if the numbers were accurate, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong would have lost more fighters than they had ever put in the field. These reports existed. They circulated. They were not acted upon. The body count continued. The war was being won. The second thing that has to be understood, and it connects directly to the first, is the concept of the free fire zone. The phrase itself is a euphemism, which means it was designed to make something easier to say. A free fire zone, or sometimes called a specified strike zone, depending on who was speaking, was a geographic area in which anyone present could be assumed to be hostile and therefore could be engaged without further authorization. The idea was that in areas where the civilian population had been evacuated, the only people remaining would be enemy fighters, so any person visible from a helicopter or detected by a patrol could be treated as a combatant. The reality was that evacuations were never complete. People returned to their homes. Farmers who depended on particular land for their survival could not simply leave and wait for the military operations to conclude. Old people who could not move stayed. People who did not receive evacuation notices stayed. People who received the notices and did not believe them or did not trust the soldiers delivering them stayed. The zones were declared free fire. People in them were killed. The people who were killed were counted as enemy dead. The counts were reported. Somewhere in Saigon a number was updated. Somewhere in Washington a briefing was slightly more optimistic than it would have been otherwise. The soldiers who pulled the triggers in these operations were not monsters in any meaningful clinical sense. They were young men, typically very young, who had been trained to follow orders in an environment where the line between civilian and combatant had been institutionally erased. The system they operated within told them that presence in a designated zone was itself evidence of enemy intent. They were not taught to ask whether the zone had been properly evacuated. They were not equipped with the information needed to ask that question. They were given a target designation and a weapon and a set of rules that had been carefully constructed to authorize what was about to happen. They followed the rules. The rules were the problem. The villages that were destroyed during these operations are worth considering individually, not as a category but as specific places with specific histories and specific populations. But the scale makes individual consideration nearly impossible. The Department of Defense estimated that by the early 1970s, approximately 4 million Vietnamese had been displaced from their homes by the combination of combat operations, bombing campaigns, and the deliberate depopulation strategies associated with the pacification program. 4 million. The number is too large to process as a human reality, which may be part of why it rarely appeared in press briefings. It was easier to talk about body counts than displacement. Bodies implied victory. Displacement implied something more complicated. The pacification program itself deserves careful attention because it illustrates better than almost anything else how the war operated simultaneously on two tracks that rarely intersected. On the official track, pacification was a hearts and minds operation, a program designed to win the loyalty of the South Vietnamese population by providing security, development assistance, agricultural support, and governance improvements. On the operational track, pacification often meant the destruction of villages believed to harbor Viet Cong sympathizers, the forced relocation of populations, the construction of strategic hamlets that concentrated rural populations in controlled areas surrounded by wire and watchtowers. The official track was described in press releases. The operational track was described in after-action reports that were classified and remained classified for years or decades. The Phoenix program, which ran from roughly 1965 to 1972, was one component of the pacification effort that has received some public attention, but considerably less than it warrants. The program was designed to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, meaning the political and administrative network that allowed the insurgency to function in rural areas. Neutralization was defined in the program's official documentation as capture, defection, or death. In practice, the balance between those three outcomes was heavily weighted toward the third. CIA estimates suggested that Phoenix resulted in the killing of somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 Vietnamese, depending on which period and which source. South Vietnamese estimates were higher. The program's American administrators acknowledged in congressional testimony that some portion of those killed were not in fact Viet Cong infrastructure, but rather personal enemies of South Vietnamese officials who had been falsely identified. The mechanism for false identification was nearly frictionless. A local official with a grudge needed only to put a name on a list. The soldiers and operatives who carried out Phoenix operations understood in varying degrees what they were participating in. Some had detailed briefings that left no ambiguity about the program's intent. Others were told they were conducting intelligence operations and came to understand the reality incrementally, operation by operation. The psychological effect of this incremental understanding was significant and poorly studied. Men who had enlisted or been drafted believing they were fighting a conventional war against a foreign aggressor found themselves operating as part of a system that killed people based on administrative lists compiled by officials whose reliability was never independently verified. The dissonance between the war they had expected and the war they were actually in produced effects that military psychiatrists were not fully equipped to diagnose, and that the VA was not fully equipped to treat. Fragging is a word that entered the American vocabulary during Vietnam and has largely stayed there, which is unusual because most military terminology from that era has faded. The word refers to the practice of soldiers killing or attempting to kill their own officers, typically using fragmentation grenades because they left ambiguous forensic evidence. The practice is documented. The Army's own records indicate that between 1969 and 1971, there were over 900 reported fragging incidents, and the number of unreported incidents was understood to be substantially higher. By 1971, the Army was running internal assessments of unit cohesion that described morale in terms typically reserved for armies on the verge of collapse. The reasons for fragging were not simple and should not be treated as simple. Some incidents were the result of racial tensions that had intensified as the civil rights movement at home created fissures inside units deployed abroad. Some were the result of conflicts over drug use, which had become widespread enough by the late 1960s that commanders who attempted to enforce regulations found themselves in direct conflict with the majority of their enlisted men. Some incidents were driven by what soldiers described as reckless leadership. Officers who seemed to value performance metrics and personal advancement over the lives of the men under them, who would order patrols into areas known to be heavily mined because the patrol would generate contact and contact would generate statistics. The men understood what was happening. They had no formal mechanism for addressing it. Some of them addressed it informally. The drug situation in Vietnam is often mentioned in historical accounts, but rarely examined with the granularity it requires. Marijuana use was widespread from the early years of American involvement, partly because it was cheap and available, and partly because it served functions that alcohol did not, including reduced appetite in conditions where rations were inadequate, muted emotional response in conditions where emotional response was dangerous, and social cohesion in units where formal camaraderie had broken down. By the late 1960s, heroin had become available in forms and at prices that were accessible to enlisted men on military pay. The heroin available in Vietnam was of extremely high purity compared to what was available in American cities, which meant that addiction developed faster and the withdrawal process was more severe. The military's response to the drug situation went through several phases that reflected different institutional priorities rather than coherent treatment philosophy. Initially, drug use was treated primarily as a disciplinary matter, which meant that soldiers who sought help were risking punishment, which meant that most soldiers who needed help did not seek it. Later, under pressure from Congress, and in response to the political visibility of returning addicted veterans, the military implemented treatment programs that were inadequately staffed and operated within systems that still carried punitive implications. Some studies conducted during this period suggested that addiction rates among Vietnam veterans were substantially higher than addiction rates among veterans of comparable age who had not served in Vietnam. The studies were contested. The programs remained inadequate. The men came home. The question of what soldiers knew about the war's strategic situation is important and under-examined. The official position, maintained through most of the war, was that progress was being made, that the enemy was being degraded, that the South Vietnamese government and military were developing the capacity to defend themselves, and that American forces were not fighting indefinitely, but rather buying time for a transition that was always slightly over the horizon. The men in the field had access to different information. They had the information of repetition. They could see that the villages they had cleared last month required clearing again this month. They could see that the roads they had secured required securing again. They could see that the enemy's ability to sustain operations had not appreciably diminished despite everything that the body counts claimed. The gap between what they knew and what they were being told was not subtle. It was enormous. It was visible every day. The response to this gap varied enormously among individuals. Some soldiers maintained a kind of functional disengagement, performing their duties without investing in the official narrative, because investing in narratives that contradicted observable reality required a kind of cognitive effort that combat conditions left no room for. Some soldiers became angry in ways that required management and sometimes exploded in forms that were destructive to themselves and the people around them. Some soldiers wrote letters home that contained more than they intended to reveal, and families received letters full of careful omissions that nonetheless communicated something essential about the nature of the experience. Some soldiers talked to journalists. This last category created problems. The relationship between the military and the press corps in Vietnam went through a profound transformation between the early 1960s and the early 1970s. In the early period, most correspondents were working within frameworks that had been established during the Second World War, frameworks that assumed a fundamental alignment between American military operations and American democratic values that positioned the press as a chronicler of heroism rather than a monitor of conduct. The military press system in Vietnam initially operated under similar assumptions, offering reporters access and assistance in exchange for coverage that supported the official narrative. For several years, this arrangement worked reasonably well from the military's perspective. It began to break down for reasons that were structural rather than the result of individual journalistic decisions. Reporters who spent extended time in the field, who traveled with units rather than attending briefings in Saigon, who developed relationships with Vietnamese civilians and with junior officers and enlisted men rather than exclusively with senior command, began to produce accounts that diverged from the official version in ways that were verifiable and documented. The divergence was not primarily a matter of ideology. It was a matter of geography. The people closest to what was happening saw different things than the people in Saigon. The military's response to unfavorable coverage evolved gradually toward active obstruction. Reporters who filed stories that contradicted the official narrative found their accreditation threatened or revoked. Sources who spoke to journalists about conditions on the ground were investigated and sometimes prosecuted. Intelligence assessments that supported pessimistic conclusions were classified at higher levels, making them less available to reporters pursuing specific stories. The system did not operate through a single conspiracy, but through hundreds of individual decisions made by officers and officials who understood what kind of information was welcome and adjusted their behavior accordingly. The result was that the press corps was, for years, producing a version of the war that was somewhere between the official version and the ground truth, never entirely either. The ground truth included things that were present in classified documents and after-action reports and Inspector General investigations, but almost never in public discourse. It included the systematic destruction of records. Units that had conducted operations resulting in civilian casualties, operations that were potentially in violation of the laws of war, sometimes ensured that the documentary record of those operations was incomplete or absent. This was not standard practice in the sense of being authorized, but it was common practice in the sense of being widespread and understood. Officers who valued their careers over historical accuracy had strong incentives to ensure that the record was favorable. The mechanisms for ensuring this were simple. Documents could be misfiled or destroyed. After-action reports could be written in language that accurately described events in individual sentences while constructing in aggregate a false picture of what had occurred. The events at My Lai are well known in outline, but inadequately understood in context. In March of 1968, soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry, entered the hamlet of My Lai and killed somewhere between 350 and 500 unarmed civilians over the course of several hours. The soldiers had been told to expect resistance. They found no resistance. They killed the people they found anyway. Officers on the ground directed the killing. Officers overhead in helicopters watched it occur. One helicopter crew, led by Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, attempted to intervene and ultimately reported the incident through official channels. The report was buried. The massacre was covered up for over a year by the same command structure that had ordered the operation. What made My Lai particularly revealing was not the massacre itself, which was the extreme end of a spectrum of operations rather than something without precedent, but the cover-up and the subsequent investigation. The Army's own investigation, the Peers Commission, concluded that the cover-up extended through multiple levels of command and involved numerous officers who had either witnessed the event, received reports of it, or been in a position to investigate and chose not to. The Commission identified over 24 officers who should have been charged with various offenses. Of those, only one officer, Lieutenant William Calley, was ultimately convicted. He was convicted of killing 22 civilians. His sentence was subsequently commuted by President Nixon following public pressure, and he served 3.5 years under house arrest at Fort Benning before being released. The outcome of the My Lai proceedings sent a message that was received clearly by the Army. The message was that accountability had limits. The message was that the systematic production of conditions in which atrocities occurred would not be scrutinized with the same rigor as the atrocities themselves. The officers who had built and maintained the operational environment, who had created the free fire zones and the body count incentives and the dehumanizing terminology and the command culture that treated Vietnamese lives as metrics, those officers were not the ones who would bear consequences. A young lieutenant, one of the more directly implicated individuals in a chain of culpability that extended far above him, would represent the war's failure to meet its own stated standards. The failure would be contained. The structure that produced it would remain. The war's relationship with race is inseparable from its relationship with justice, and it is also one of the aspects of the conflict that received the least adequate treatment both during and after the fact. African-American men were drafted and served in Vietnam at rates disproportionate to their representation in the population, partly because educational deferments that protected middle-class and upper-middle-class white men from the draft were less available to black men who had been systematically excluded from the educational opportunities that would have qualified them for those deferments. This disparity was documented in the draft records. It was reported. It became part of the civil rights movement's critique of the war. It did not change the draft system in any meaningful way. Once in Vietnam, black soldiers encountered a military that was in many ways a microcosm of the racial dynamics of American society in the late 1960s, which meant that it was undergoing the same convulsions and the same violences that those dynamics produced everywhere else. Racial incidents within units were common. The military justice system applied penalties unevenly in ways that disadvantaged black soldiers. Promotions to non-commissioned officer ranks were slower for black soldiers on average. The riot that occurred at Long Binh Jail in August of 1968, a military detention facility, sometimes referred to by its informal name in ways that reflected the racial tensions it contained, involved black soldiers protesting conditions that they described as conditions of incarceration within incarceration, of being imprisoned in a war zone in a facility that replicated the worst conditions of American civilian prisons. The military's response to racial conflict within units tended towards suppression rather than address. Soldiers who raised complaints about racial disparities in treatment or assignment or discipline were documented as troublemakers, flagged in ways that affected their service records and their post-service access to benefits. The institutional incentive was to maintain unit cohesion by enforcing silence, rather than to maintain unit cohesion by resolving the conditions that were producing conflict. This approach produced short-term compliance at the cost of long-term damage, both to the individuals involved and to the units that contained them. The question of what happened to the men who refused is one that history has not handled well. There were soldiers who refused direct orders to participate in specific operations, soldiers who refused to fire on civilians, soldiers who put down their weapons in the field and told their officers they would not continue. Most of these refusals are not in any accessible record. Some of the men who refused were court-martialed, some were reassigned. Some were dealt with informally in ways that depended entirely on the character of the officer involved, which meant that the consequences ranged from serious military charges to quiet reassignment to something in between that left the soldier technically functional but practically marginalized. The men who refused and who later tried to talk about what they had seen found that their refusal was interpreted by some as evidence of unreliability, that the very act of having drawn a moral line in the field made their subsequent testimony suspect in ways that the testimony of men who had not drawn that line was not. The treatment of Vietnamese civilians who cooperated with American forces deserves specific and sustained attention, because the scale of the abandonment involved is difficult to overstate. Throughout the war, American operations depended on the cooperation of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers in ways that went beyond the formal South Vietnamese military alliance. Interpreters, intelligence sources, village officials who provided information about Viet Cong movements, families who housed American advisors, individuals who risked their lives and their families' lives on the assumption that American presence would be durable and American promises would be honored. The promises made to these people were made in good faith by many of the individuals making them. The system those individuals served was not designed to honor the promises. As American involvement wound down and the prospect of withdrawal became real, the implications for cooperative Vietnamese became clear to anyone willing to think about them. People who had worked with American forces would be identifiable to the Viet Cong and to the North Vietnamese Army as collaborators. Their fates would not be good. The American system for managing this reality was inadequate in ways that were known and documented. The visa and evacuation processes that were supposed to protect at-risk Vietnamese were slow, bureaucratic, and fundamentally not scaled for the actual number of people at risk. Officers in the field who understood the danger to their sources and their interpreters pushed for expedited evacuation. The requests moved slowly through systems that had other priorities. When the end came in April of 1975, it came faster than most official projections had anticipated, which itself reflects something important about the reliability of official projections throughout the entire conflict. The evacuation was chaotic and incomplete. Tens of thousands of Vietnamese who had worked with American forces were left behind. Many of them were subsequently imprisoned in re-education camps, where conditions were documented as severe and prolonged. Some were executed. The chaos of the final evacuation was genuine, and some of it was unavoidable. But the scale of the failure was not simply a result of the final 48 hours. It was the result of years of inadequate planning, inadequate resourcing, and institutional resistance to planning for an outcome that planners were not supposed to acknowledge as possible. The psychological aftermath of Vietnam among American veterans is well documented, in the sense that the documentation exists, and poorly understood in the sense that the documentation has not fully penetrated public understanding. Post-traumatic stress disorder as a clinical category was substantially shaped by the work of researchers and clinicians who were studying Vietnam veterans in the early 1970s before the disorder had the name it now carries. The symptoms that these researchers were documenting, intrusive memories, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, social disconnection, difficulty with intimate relationships, were present in veterans of earlier wars, but had been attributed to moral failing, weakness of character, insufficient patriotism, Vietnam produced enough affected veterans in a sufficiently concentrated period that the symptom cluster became impossible to dismiss as individual character defect. What the research showed, and what has been subsequently confirmed by decades of additional work, is that the psychological damage produced by combat was not primarily a function of the individual soldier's prior psychological health, but was substantially a function of the nature of the combat itself. Specifically, the research found that certain features of the Vietnam War, the ambiguity of the enemy, the absence of defined fronts or clear objectives, the impossibility of distinguishing hostile from non-hostile actors, the pressure to participate in actions that violated the soldier's own moral frameworks were more strongly associated with psychological damage than direct exposure to conventional combat. Men who had served in the most dangerous conventional combat roles were not necessarily the most psychologically damaged. Men who had been placed in situations where every choice felt morally contaminated often were. The VA system that these men returned to was not equipped to treat what they were experiencing. This is not primarily a critique of the individuals working within that system, many of whom were trying to do their jobs in conditions of significant resource constraint. It is a structural critique. The VA system had been designed in the context of previous wars in which the dominant psychological presentation in returning veterans was something closer to grief and adjustment difficulty than to the complex trauma patterns that Vietnam produced. The diagnostic categories available to VA clinicians did not map well onto what they were seeing. The treatment modalities available were limited. The institutional culture of the VA, like the institutional culture of the military, had certain ambient skepticism about psychological complaints that were not accompanied by physical injury, an inheritance from decades of treating psychological suffering as weakness or malingering. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans is a statistic that has been presented in many different ways over the years, some more accurate than others. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the rate of completed suicide among Vietnam veterans was elevated compared to demographically comparable men who had not served, that the elevation persisted for decades after the war ended, and that the number of Vietnam veterans who died by their own hands after returning home substantially exceeded the number who died in combat. The number is not presented here as a condemnation of any individual or institution, but as a factual statement about the war's cost, a cost that was distributed over decades rather than compressed into the period of active combat, and was therefore less visible, less politically salient, and less likely to appear in the official accounting of what the war had consumed. The official accounting of the war was always a selective document. It counted some things and not others. It counted American military dead, eventually over 58,000. It counted, in various formats, enemy dead, though those counts were unreliable in ways that have been discussed. It counted in very general terms the South Vietnamese military dead, who numbered in the hundreds of thousands. It did not count, in any comprehensive official document, the Vietnamese civilian dead, either northern or southern. Estimates from various researchers place the civilian death toll in a range extending from 1 million to 3 million, with the uncertainty in the range reflecting not primarily the difficulty of the historical research, but the absence of systematic records, which was itself a function of how the war was managed and how the people killed in it were categorized. The chemical agents used in Vietnam produced consequences that extended decades beyond the combat period and into the bodies of soldiers and Vietnamese civilians alike. Agent Orange, a defoliant used extensively from the early 1960s through 1971, contained dioxin as a contaminant at levels that subsequent research demonstrated to be carcinogenic and teratogenic. The areas sprayed covered millions of acres of Vietnamese landscape. The soldiers who served in sprayed areas absorbed the chemical through skin contact and respiratory exposure. The Vietnamese who lived in sprayed areas farmed sprayed land, drank water from sprayed watersheds, experienced exposures that in some cases were more severe and more prolonged than those of American soldiers. The American government's acknowledgement of Agent Orange's health consequences was slow and fought at every stage. Veterans who developed cancers and other conditions associated with dioxin exposure spent years, in many cases decades, pursuing compensation claims through a VA system that was institutionally resistant to acknowledging the connection between the chemical exposure and the disease. The resistance was not irrational from the government's perspective. Acknowledging the connection would trigger liability. It would require payment. It would require admitting that soldiers had been exposed to a substance that the government knew, or should have known, posed health risks. The internal documents of the chemical manufacturers who produced Agent Orange, documents that became available through litigation, showed that concerns about dioxin contamination had been raised within the industry before and during the period of widespread use. Those concerns did not stop production. They did not stop use. The Vietnamese government's estimates of the number of Vietnamese affected by Agent Orange-related health conditions run into the millions. These estimates include not only people directly exposed during the period of use, but subsequent generations, children and grandchildren of exposed individuals who were born with birth defects. That research has linked to dioxin exposure. The multi-generational aspect of the chemical's consequences is one of the reasons the full cost of the war cannot be measured within the period of the war itself. It extends forward in time in ways that the official accounting has never adequately captured. The role of the South Vietnamese government and military in the war is a subject that American accounts have generally treated with less scrutiny than the subject warrants. The official American position required that the South Vietnamese government be characterized as legitimate, as representing the genuine aspirations of the South Vietnamese people as a functioning democratic entity worth defending. The reality was considerably more complicated and was known to be complicated by virtually everyone with detailed knowledge of it. The South Vietnamese government was a succession of regimes, some more stable than others, most of them characterized by significant corruption, most of them relying on patronage networks that prioritized political loyalty over administrative competence, most of them unable or unwilling to pursue the reforms that American advisors identified as necessary for the government to develop genuine popular legitimacy. The South Vietnamese military, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, was an institution whose capacity was simultaneously indispensable to American strategy and consistently overestimated in American assessments. The ARVN contained units of genuine quality and individual soldiers of great courage and competence, and this is not a minor qualification. But the institution as a whole suffered from the consequences of the patronage system that produced its officer corps, from the effects of a draft system that bore heavily on the poor and allowed the connected to escape service, from the morale effects of a war that had lasted longer than any institution could sustain without deterioration. American advisors who worked closely with ARVN units and who wrote honest assessments of their capacity frequently found those assessments receiving skepticism from higher command because the assessments implied an inconvenient reality about the prospects for Vietnamization. The policy of transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces that was supposed to allow American withdrawal without abandonment. The intelligence failures of the Vietnam War were systemic and would not be resolved by better collection. The problem was not primarily that the American intelligence apparatus lacked information. The CIA, military intelligence, and various other collection systems produced enormous quantities of information about enemy capabilities, intentions, and movements throughout the conflict. The problem was that the information was processed and reported within an institutional culture that was powerfully incentivized to produce optimistic assessments. Analysts who wrote pessimistic assessments found their careers affected in ways that were not punitive in any formal sense, but were clearly consequential. Assessments that challenged the prevailing official optimism required justification that optimistic assessments did not. The system produced what the system was built to produce, which was not accurate intelligence, but rather intelligence that conformed to the preferences of the people who received it. The most dramatic illustration of this problem occurred in the period before the Tet Offensive of January 1968. The intelligence community had collected substantial information indicating that a major coordinated enemy operation was being planned. Debate within the intelligence community about the significance and scale of this operation was ongoing. A significant disagreement centered on the question of how to count enemy forces, specifically whether irregular forces and political cadre should be included in the official enemy order of battle estimates. Including them would have significantly increased the apparent size of the enemy and would have directly challenged official claims about the war's progress. The decision was made to exclude them. The official estimates remained reassuring. The Tet Offensive, when it came, struck over 100 locations simultaneously and demonstrated a scale of enemy capability that the official estimates had denied was possible. The political impact of Tet cannot be separated from the credibility gap it exposed. What broke American public support for the war was not Tet itself, not simply the deaths and the images, but the demonstration that the official narrative had been false. People who had been told for years that the war was being won, who had watched briefings that used the word progress, who had consumed official statements calibrated to maintain support, looked at their television screens in January and February of 1968 and saw that something had been taken from them. Not just lives, not just money. The thing that had been taken was more fundamental than either of those. What had been taken was the assumption that the government was telling them the truth about the things that mattered most. The anti-war movement that grew in response to the credibility gap is often described in terms of the cultural conflict it produced. The confrontations between protesters and police, the generational fracture, the social disruption. What is less often discussed is the number of people within the military and the government who privately agreed with the movement's basic assessment. There were senior military officers who believed the war was not winnable. There were officials in the State Department and the CIA who believed the policy was misconceived. There were people who had access to the classified intelligence and who understood that the official statements were inconsistent with what the intelligence showed. Most of these people continued to do their jobs. They filed their reports. They attended their meetings. They did not resign in protest. The handful who did were treated by the institution as defectors and by history as footnotes. Daniel Ellsberg is perhaps the most prominent exception to this pattern, and his case is instructive not because he represents what happened, but because he represents what so rarely happened. Ellsberg worked for the Rand Corporation and the Defense Department and had access to the classified history of American decision-making in Vietnam that was compiled under Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, a study that became known as the Pentagon Papers. The study documented in meticulous detail how successive administrations had made decisions they knew would not achieve their stated objectives, how the public rationale for escalation had been constructed after the decisions were already made, how the commitment had been maintained by a succession of officials who privately doubted its premises but publicly defended them. Ellsberg copied the study and gave it to journalists. The Nixon administration attempted to prevent its publication and failed. The papers were published. What the Pentagon Papers revealed was that the deception was not incidental to the war, but structural to it. It was not that individual officials had occasionally told untruths in moments of political pressure. It was that the management of public perception had been a primary objective of the policy-making process from the beginning, that decisions had been made based partly on their domestic political implications rather than exclusively on their strategic merits, and that the gap between public statements and private assessments had been present and consistent throughout the entire history of American involvement. The papers covered the period through 1967. The subsequent years of the war, the period not covered by the study, did not represent a departure from this pattern. The Christmas bombing of December 1972, the operation officially designated Linebacker 2, is an example of the war's logic operating in its late phase when the diplomatic context had shifted, but the operational logic had not. The bombing, which targeted Hanoi and Haiphong with the heaviest air campaign of the war, was ordered by President Nixon in response to a breakdown in negotiations with North Vietnam. The stated purpose was to compel North Vietnamese concessions at the negotiating table. The bombing lasted 11 days, killed an estimated 1,600 civilians in Hanoi and surrounding areas, and destroyed significant civilian infrastructure. Afterward, both sides returned to the negotiating table and reached an agreement that was, in its essential terms, similar to the agreement that had been available before the bombing began. The bombing had produced the political appearance of leverage without the substantive effect of leverage. The deaths of 1,600 civilians were the cost of that appearance. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, ended direct American military involvement without resolving the conflict between North and South Vietnam. The Nixon administration presented the accords as a form of peace with honor, a phrase carefully chosen to address the domestic political requirement that the withdrawal not appear to be a defeat, while acknowledging the practical reality that the agreement did not guarantee the survival of South Vietnam. The accords required American withdrawal and provided for a ceasefire, but the ceasefire was violated almost immediately by both sides, and the American capacity to enforce the agreement's terms through continued military action had been significantly constrained by congressional action and by the Watergate scandal that was consuming the Nixon administration. The South Vietnamese government understood that the accords represented, at minimum, a significant deterioration in its strategic position and possibly a prelude to its collapse. President Thieu was reportedly furious at the terms and had to be persuaded to sign through a combination of private American reassurances and explicit threat. The reassurances, which included promises of continued American military and economic support, and suggestions that American forces might return if North Vietnam violated the agreement significantly, were made by an administration that was not in a position to honor them. The subsequent Congress, in the aftermath of Watergate and in response to the anti-war sentiment that had been building for years, passed legislation restricting the president's ability to recommit forces to Vietnam. The reassurances became impossible to honor. The South Vietnamese government was left with the accords and without the backing those accords had implicitly promised. The final fall of South Vietnam in April 1975 has been analyzed extensively in terms of its military dimensions, the speed of the North Vietnamese advance, the collapse of ARVN resistance, the failure of American material support to compensate for strategic and institutional weaknesses. What has received less attention is the internal experience of the South Vietnamese population during those final weeks and months. The decisions that ordinary people had to make about whether to stay or flee, about what to believe and who to trust, about which of the competing futures was most likely and what it would mean for them. For many people, the calculus was impossibly difficult because the information available was unreliable, the options were limited, and the speed of events compressed the time available for decision. People who had worked with American forces or the South Vietnamese government faced the most acute danger. Many of them could not get out. The systems designed to help them had not been adequately maintained. The refugees who fled Vietnam in the period following 1975, the boat people whose numbers eventually reached into the hundreds of thousands, represent one of the human consequences of the war that was visible enough to receive some public attention, but whose full scale and suffering has never been comprehensively accounted for in the American narrative of the conflict. People left in boats that were inadequate for ocean passage. People died at sea in numbers that were documented only partially because the documentation depended on survival. People were attacked by pirates in the Gulf of Thailand with a regularity that regional governments knew about and inadequately addressed. People arrived in refugee camps in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and faced processing systems that were slow and uncertain and sometimes hostile. The veterans who returned to the United States from Vietnam came home to a country that had not prepared a coherent response to their return. The social and political climate surrounding the war meant that veterans occupied an ambiguous position in American culture, neither celebrated in the manner of Second World War veterans nor uniformly condemned, but rather occupying an uncomfortable middle ground that reflected the country's unresolved feelings about the war itself. Many veterans reported encountering hostility or indifference. Many reported feeling that the country wanted to move on from the war faster than they were capable of moving on, that the impulse to put Vietnam behind was in direct tension with the reality that they could not put it behind them. The particular difficulty of returning from Vietnam, as opposed to other wars, involved the absence of the transitional period that had existed for previous generations of veterans. World War II veterans had returned to a country where the transition from soldier to civilian had been socially structured, where ceremonies and community reception had marked the shift, where a period of adjustment had been implicitly recognized as necessary. Vietnam veterans often flew home from combat zones directly to American cities within 24 hours of their last operation. One day in the field, the next day in an American airport. The decompression that the mind and body require after prolonged exposure to combat conditions was simply not available in that structure. Men arrived home carrying everything they had been through with nowhere to put it. The process by which the country developed something approaching a shared understanding of the war, or at least a shared acknowledgement of what the men who fought it deserved, was slow and contested, and in important ways remains incomplete. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, dedicated in 1982, represented a significant moment in this process, partly because the memorial itself was designed in a way that prioritized the dead and their individual names over the conventional iconography of military commemoration, and partly because the process of building the memorial involved its own controversies that reflected the ongoing difficulty of reaching consensus about what the war meant. The memorial became a site of sustained public engagement, of people searching for specific names, leaving objects, confronting something about the war that the preceding decade of political and cultural argument had not provided. But memorials are not accounting. They register the dead, they register. The 58,000 names on the memorial wall represent the American military dead. They do not represent the Vietnamese dead in any category. They do not represent the veterans who died of wounds and illnesses that the VA declined to attribute to service. They do not represent the veterans who died by suicide in the years and decades following the war. The wall is important. The wall is incomplete. The incompleteness is not the wall's failure. It is a reflection of how the accounting was always conducted, of which lives were considered countable and which were considered background. The official history of the war, as taught in American schools and reflected in the dominant cultural products about Vietnam, has undergone revision since the 1970s, but has not fully incorporated the range of documented experience. The tendency has been to frame the war as a tragedy, as something that produced suffering on all sides, as a conflict in which American intentions were good, even if the execution was flawed. This framing is not without merit. American intentions were genuinely mixed and some of them were genuinely good. But the framing also tends to suppress the more uncomfortable conclusions that the documented record supports. Conclusions about institutional dishonesty, about the systematic production of conditions in which atrocities could occur, about the decisions made to continue a war whose premises the decision-makers privately doubted for years while publicly maintaining that progress was occurring. The men who fought the war, the ones who are still alive, carry versions of it that are not represented in the standard account. Many of them have not talked about what they saw and did, not because they lack the language, but because they have found, over decades of attempting to communicate their experience, that the standard framework for receiving that communication is inadequate to it. The standard framework wants heroes and victims and lessons. The experience they are trying to describe contains all of those things, but also contains things for which the framework has no category, experiences of moral complexity that exceed what the available language can carry without distortion. The silence that surrounds certain aspects of veteran experience is not simple denial. It is something more specific. It is the recognition that the full account, if delivered, would require the listener to confront things about the war and about the institutions that prosecuted the war and about the country that sent the soldiers to it, things that the listener may not be prepared or willing to confront. It is easier to talk about what was endured than about what was done. It is easier to describe combat as a condition that happened to you than to describe combat as a sequence of choices, some of which were defensible and some of which were not. The silence is partly protection of self and partly protection of the listener, and partly a recognition that the full truth, offered without omission, would not be received as intended. The people who designed the policies that created the conditions in Vietnam, who built the free fire zones and the Phoenix program and the body count system and the strategic Hamlet program and all the other mechanisms through which the war was prosecuted, most of them returned to their lives in Washington and in the private sector and in academia, and were received as experienced men of affairs whose expertise was valuable and whose service was honored. Some wrote memoirs. Some gave interviews in which they discussed the war's failures in terms of strategic miscalculation and intelligence failure and mismanagement. Very few discussed the specific human consequences of specific decisions in terms that acknowledged direct personal responsibility. The language available for discussing the war's failures at the policy level was an abstract language of systems and errors and lessons learned, not a language of faces and names and bodies. Robert McNamara, who served as Secretary of Defense during the critical years of escalation from 1961 to 1968, published a memoir in 1995 in which he acknowledged that the war had been a mistake, that he and others had known it was going wrong and had continued it anyway. The memoir produced a significant public reaction, including substantial anger from veterans who felt that the acknowledgement came too late and was insufficient to the scale of what had been decided and continued. McNamara said he was sorry. He described the suffering his decisions had helped produce. He did not describe a path from acknowledgement to accountability because no such path existed in any institutional sense. The war had ended. The men were dead. The apology existed in the space where accountability would have been if accountability had been possible. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong dead, whose numbers are estimated variously at between 800,000 and over 1 million military fatalities, are present in the American account of the war largely as abstraction. They appear in body count statistics and in strategic assessments and in the military literature as a measurement of effectiveness. They appear very rarely as individuals. The same asymmetry applies to the Vietnamese civilians killed in the South, who appear most often as byproducts of operations rather than as subjects of the war's history. The Vietnamese who are most present as individuals in the American account are the South Vietnamese allies, particularly those who suffered following the American withdrawal, whose fate has been used most frequently in arguments about the consequences of American withdrawal, arguments that invoke Vietnamese suffering in service of American political positions rather than as primary subject. The war continued after its purpose had dissolved, not once, but several times. It continued after the Tet Offensive had demonstrated the falsity of the official assessments. It continued after the Pentagon Papers had demonstrated that the decision-makers had known for years that the war was not achievable on the terms being stated publicly. It continued after the domestic political consensus that had supported it had fractured beyond recovery. It continued because institutions in motion tend to continue, because the careers and reputations of senior officials were invested in the continuation, because admitting that the war was lost required admitting that everything done in its prosecution had been done in service of a goal that was never reachable, and that admission was too large for the institutions involved to make while they were still operating. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March of 1973. The South Vietnamese government continued to fight with American material support and without American combat personnel. The fighting continued until April of 1975. In the 2 years between the American withdrawal and the fall of Saigon, the war killed tens of thousands more people on all sides. The peace that the Paris Accords had announced did not exist. The war that American involvement had sought to prevent, a unified Vietnam under communist control, occurred. The 58,000 American dead, and the perhaps 2 million Vietnamese dead, had not prevented this outcome. The outcome had been available earlier, on terms that would not have been substantially different, and the decision to continue had been made by people who understood, in private, what they were continuing and why and what it was likely to cost. The Marines who stood at the gates of the American embassy in Saigon on April 29, 1975, and watched the crowds of Vietnamese pressing forward, the people who had American connections, the people who had been promised consideration, the people who understood what was coming and needed to leave and could not get through the gates that the Marines had been ordered to hold. Those Marines understood something in that moment that is not fully captured by any of the official accounts that followed. They were at the end of something, at the visible terminal point of a long sequence of decisions and policies and statements and operations and silences. The helicopters came. The last Americans left. The gates closed. The war had been going on for decades by some measures and had cost in the vicinity of 3 million lives by the most cautious estimates, and had ended with the side that American policy had sought to prevent from winning in control of the entire country, and the machinery of the American military and the American government moved on to other concerns, carrying its institutional memory and its institutional habits and its institutional resistance to full accounting intact into whatever would come next.